In particular, for our purposes in this story of Our Lady of the Cape, we see in the written record how these first settlers in the region brought over from Old France the three aspects of their ancient Catholic tradition which point directly to our shrine: the tradition of devotion to Our Lady, the tradition of pilgrimage to her shrines, and the tradition of her rosary. Evidence of devotion to Our Lady is everywhere. The first church in the region is named after her Immaculate Conception. The first chapel at Cap-de-la-Madeleine is built on a place called Fief Sainte-Marie. The first hospital at the Cape is called Our Lady of Pity, and so on. One quotation is especially apt to join this devotion to evidence of the old tradition of pilgrimage and to show us that when these Christians were most seriously threatened, it was to Our Lady and to her shrines that they turned for aid. It occurs in the Jesuit relation for 1651, the very year in which Cap-de-la-Madeleine was founded. The Jesuit writer continues, "We have only been able to carry on by a miracle. Our habitants attribute their preservation to the extraordinary recourse they have had to the Blessed Virgin, to whom they have a little shrine in each house, one being dedicated to Our Lady of Liesse, others to Our Lady of Virtues, of Perpetual Help, of Good News, of Victory, and a number of other titles by which the Blessed Virgin is honored in various places of Christendom. It is an ordinary devotion of these poor habitants to visit these little shrines on various days of the week, principally on Saturdays when the gatherings are greatest. And in each house, morning and evening, everyone assembles to say the litany of the Blessed Virgin. It is ordinarily the head of the family who leads the prayers, and to whom the other women, children, and servants respond. Is not this an extraordinary and prophetic picture? Think of this little group of families, shut off in a wilderness, thousands of miles away from home, nothing between them and death but their own strength and their own courage, living lives of pioneer bareness and simplicity. Yet they bring into this drab place, into these wild dangers, the warmth, the colors, and the feeling of security they knew at the well-loved shrines of old France. They kneel down in the midst of imminent danger, a Catholic family at prayer, in their own home before their own favorite statue of their Heavenly Mother. The faith, the family, and Our Lady gathered in a little circle of light to bring blessing on a dark land that was being won, foot by perilous and laborious foot, to civilization and the cross. What must those little daily processions from cabin to cabin have been like? A few candles, perhaps held in toil-worn hands, nostalgic hymns of the old land, falling peacefully on ears attuned all day to the threat of imminent danger. How the scene carries the mind forward to the shrine that the faith of these men and women, and of their children and their children's children, will one day build. 300 years later, we can see the same scene reenacted time after time on the grounds of Cap-de-la-Madeleine, in greater numbers perhaps, and with greater display, but with no greater faith, no greater devotion. Thousands of pilgrims bearing the names and still carrying the faith left them by that handful of families, walked the grounds at Cap-de-la-Madeleine as they walked the rough paths from house to house, singing the same praises to the same queen and bearing candles in symbol of the same constant devotion. And the 20th century pilgrims will often have in their hearts the same petition that went up from their fathers. And just as their fathers sought Mary's aid that they might pass on the faith to them, so they now come to the same source for help in keeping that faith secure and passing it on in turn to their sons, preserved under Mary's protecting mantle that comes to us when we join the simple description of the old chronicle to the processions that still take place day after day, year after year, at Our Lady's shrine in Cap-de-la-Madeleine. The outstanding reference to the rosary we have in the early days of the shrine is also a link between the old France and the new, as well as the foreshadowing of things to come. For, in all the historical records of that time, there is no clearer example of the rosary being used as a means of bringing people to the faith than the story of Father Bouteau, the founder of Cap-de-la-Madeleine, and the First Nations people from the upper reaches of the St. Maurice River. We have seen how the rosary had just blossomed in the Old World, in time to be brought to the new, and how it became a familiar symbol of the true faith. Several of the references to it in the Jesuit relations and journals bear witness to this familiarity with the beads among the pioneers of New France. It is used, for example, as a familiar thing by which one can describe the shape of something or indicate a period of time. And Father Chauchet-Thiers, speaking of the penitential practices of some fervent First Nation converts, says, "Two of them made a hole in the ice in the depth of winter and threw themselves into the water, where they remained during the time it would take to say a rosary slowly and deliberately." We also find rosaries mentioned among the presents the Jesuits give and receive on New Year's Day. And when the superior of the Hôtel Dieu Hospital writes to France for medical supplies, she adds rosaries to the list. But the Father Buteau reference is a much different thing. It has to do with the spiritual value of the devotion itself, and it is directly connected with the Cape. Up until now, we have had no separate mention of Cap-de-la-Madeleine in all these records, for the very good reason that it did not yet exist by that name. It was simply the lip of land jutting out into the St. Lawrence on the opposite side of the St. Maurice River from the stockade settlement of Three Rivers. Three Rivers, we might say, was on the northwest corner of St. Lawrence and St. Maurice, while the Cape was on the northeast corner nearer Quebec. It was simply called the Cape. Its importance lay in the fact that it was the gathering place for the First Nations people who came down from the north for the fur trade. That is why when we hear of some of the famous Jesuit missionaries coming to spend time in their cabins in order to learn the language and become familiar with their life, we can feel sure that they were at the present site of Cap-de-la-Madeleine. And that is why Father Buteau visited the Cape so frequently and took such a great interest in it, that he became the founder of the place that has made famous all over the world the name he gave it. We know that as early as 1635, the year after Three Rivers was founded, the Jesuit was pleading with Champlain, who died on Christmas of that same year, to send some Frenchmen to teach the First Nations people to cultivate the soil and settle down in a Christian community. In this, he was following a general policy laid down by the superior, Father Lejeune, in the first relation of 1634. By this means, becoming located and seeing this miracle of charity on their behalf, they could be more easily instructed and won. It was by working steadily towards this goal that Father Buteau finally brought about the settlement of Cap-de-la-Madeleine. But before that was achieved, he would go among the First Nations people whenever they came down from the north, teaching them the truths of our faith, showing them how to pray. And the most efficacious instrument for teaching the habit of prayer, along with the knowledge of the abstract truths of the faith, was the Rosary. Here, providentially, prepared by the previous centuries, was a prayer a child could follow, and the wisest man could meditate upon for the whole of his life. The simple process of counting the beads and repeating the Hail Mary formed an easily understandable entrance into the world of Christian prayer, and placed these children seeking redemption into the kindly hands of her who brought the Redeemer into the world. The Our Father gave them the essence of all prayer, as taught from the lips of Christ himself. The Creed placed before them a brief and complete summary of the total Christian belief. And the mysteries, the heart of the Rosary, were ideally suited to their minds, a series of pictures to be thought over prayerfully. The constant repetition of the same 15 mysteries stamped the central facts of Christianity on their minds. Father Buteau did not himself realize how successful his method had been, until an adventurous journey brought him face to face with a totally unexpected and overwhelming proof of how Our Lady uses the Rosary to bring men to God. Among those who came down from the forest, the missionary had formed a special liking for the Atikamekws. Their chief had been one of his most ardent neophytes. They had often asked him to come and visit them or stay with them in their far-off village. In spite of his strong desire to do so, Father Buteau had not been able to go. His success with the Atikamekws and his skill in their language made him too valuable a man, both for the busy missions of the St. Lawrence and for the training of other missionaries. Finally, in the year 1651, just 1 year before his cruel death along the same route, his superiors granted permission, and the missionaries set out for the high reaches of the St. Maurice River. It was at the end of winter, and the journey up the softening ice of the river was an arduous one. One detailed record by Father Bouteau in his journal gives us a picture of the difficult conditions and at the same time allows us a peep into the Jesuits' devotion to the Rosary. He tells us that on Palm Sunday, they had to walk from 3 o'clock in the morning until 1 in the afternoon before they found an island on which they could say Mass. They made that icy 10-hour walk, fasting. For strength and comfort, everyone in the group carried in his hand the rosary which, the journal says, each one recited privately. Finally, 6 weeks later, and about 7 weeks after he had left Three Rivers, Father Bouteau arrived at the assembly place of his beloved Atikamekw. He was greeted by a sight that made the whole journey seem as nothing. His friend the chief had turned out to be one of the first and finest of Canada's lay apostles. He had been very far from forgetting the lessons he had learned on his trips down to the Cape. On the contrary, he had made himself their master and taught them to others. He had tried as far as he could to supplement the lack of a priest and imitate in the depths of the forest the little Christianity he had seen at Three Rivers. So when Father Bouteau entered their clearing, the first settler ever to set foot in that region, the first thing that met his eyes was a large cross standing alone in the place of honor. The first cabin he was taken to visit was a specially built place of prayer, raised in imitation of the mission chapel at Three Rivers. It was a bark cabin with a cradle-shaped roof. Inside was a sort of altar structure draped with blue coverings to which were pinned some holy pictures and a number of little crucifixes. But the best surprise of all came when the missionary questioned them on the knowledge of their faith. He was amazed at the knowledge and the piety shown by people who had never seen a priest. And he gives us the key to the method used to bring all this about. He tells us of his happiness on finding that all had their beads and knew their prayers very well, one having taught them to the others. He learned too that they had established a custom for burying their dead with a rosary wrapped around their hands. But even before his arrival, they had changed that for one with even more spiritual significance. When one member of the tribe died, his beads were given to another, who was to say them regularly for the soul of the departed. The missionary was full of joy as he headed back to Three Rivers that summer. His mind was already working on plans to repeat the same journey next year and carry it still farther till he had brought the cross and the rosary to the shores of the northern sea. That was the journey of zeal that cost him his life. But his last year on earth, which he had begun with the consoling visit to the Atikamekw, held another pleasant surprise. The ships that came from France that year brought a document which meant final success for his most cherished project and gave Cap-de-la-Madeleine its official origin and its name. The document was a deed dated March 20th, 1651, transferring a grant of land on the Cape to the Jesuit missionaries. The donation was made by a priest friend of Father Bouteau, Father Jacques, pastor of the parish of Saint Madeleine at Châteaudun in France. It put an end to the opposition against Father Bouteau's use of the land and opened the way for the fulfillment of his dream. The story of his struggle towards this fulfillment can be told much more easily and briefly than it took place. We know of his appeal for French help the year after the founding of Three Rivers in 1635. That there should be opposition was perhaps natural enough. Manpower was scarce in New France. No post had enough for its own needs, and many were of the opinion that they should strengthen what they had before stretching their meager resources to start something new. The ownership and the use of the land was constantly in dispute. Nothing permanent could be built. Then came the grant of 1651, and obstacles were swept away. The Jesuits lost no time. They moved to the Cape on November 21st of the same year. Their journal for that day says that they began to live in the Cape on the day of the presentation. Out of gratitude to their priest benefactor, they decided to name their parish after his. The place took its name from the church, and that is how the now world-famous name of Cap-de-la-Madeleine first entered the pages of history.